Anyway, what I wanted, because we're not getting this inside New Zealand in the mainstream, I've been looking from perspectives from outside New Zealand about how we are being viewed, not just because of that question, but because of the events at Albert Park. And I thought, let's go across the ditch. First up, let's talk to women, and they do exist apparently still in Australia. Let's talk to the CEO of Women's Forum Australia, Rachael Wong, and she joins us by video link now. Rachael, lovely to meet you. Hello.
Lovely to meet you too, Sean. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Look, a whole lot of New Zealanders are just waking up to this news because we have a very strange mainstream media that is in the process today of beatifying our former Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. Is there a story about New Zealand that's kicking around in other places?
Look, firstly, Sean, I just want to say thank you, well done, and bravo from women all over the world. Seriously, we're all very, very happy to see a common sense question being asked of the New Zealand Prime Minister, and just how embarrassing for him and how embarrassing for New Zealand. I've been living in Australia for the past sort of 7 or so years now and working with this organisation on women's rights and women's safety. But I'm from New Zealand. I grew up in New Zealand, and I do consider myself a Kiwi. And to see that response from the New Zealand Prime Minister was just horrendous. You'd think with the events over the past few weeks, I mean, you shouldn't need to pre-formulate an answer to such a simple question, but you'd think, given the events over the past few weeks, he would have actually, had a bit of a think about what he might say to that. But no.
Well, our mainstream media also reported that what happened in Albert Park was a wonderful rainbow celebration and day of togetherness, love and joy. Is that how it was seen in Australia?
No, I mean, look, the horrendous scenes of mob violence, 70-year-old women being punched repeatedly in the head are the images that are currently flying around the world. They're the images we've seen, obviously, on social media. In terms of the mainstream reporting it in Australia, I don't think that I think a bit better than New Zealand, just because in New Zealand there is just such a lack of media diversity. That's why it's so great to see people like yourself, Sean, and outlets like The Platform actually trying to inject a little bit of a different cultural narrative. But absolutely, over in the UK, we've seen the events with Posey Parker in New Zealand being reported on, and people just been utterly shocked that New Zealand, which was, the first country to give women the vote, is now treating women with such disdain.
Yeah. It's fair to say, too, the government hasn't done much. The police, well, they didn't intervene to protect those women in Albert Park. That is quite clear. And we made one of the people who kind of whipped up the crowd, we made him Young New Zealander of the Year. Could you believe that?
I mean, I can believe that, sadly, because of the current state of things. But again, absolutely shocking. These are people who, along with the media, along with politicians, actually incited violence against women. Women from all walks of life, political persuasions, just ordinary sort of mothers and wives and daughters. They, by perpetuating this false narrative that these women were somehow associated with neo-Nazis and of the far right and extremists, these people, including this Young New Zealander of the Year, were responsible for inciting violence. So I think it's quite shocking that he's been given that title. These,
if you like, cultural issues, gender issues are in the Western country. They are happening everywhere. It's not like New Zealand is a complete outlier. I'm wondering, though, if in a country of 5.2 million people, and I'm wondering if from an outside perspective, it is really easy in New Zealand to capture the whole country. It is really easy to change direction in New Zealand if you capture the right people. I wonder if the rest of the world isn't looking and saying, wow, they're right down the rabbit hole now, basically. Their government is right down the rabbit hole. Their media is right down the rabbit hole.
Look, I think the point about population is a good one. I think definitely that helps. I think the fact that you just have the one parliament where laws, can be easily passed through, it was also something that sort of helps to create this kind of climate. What I have said multiple times, and again, why I'm so grateful to see outlets like yours, is that there is an incredible lack of media diversity in New Zealand. The mainstream media is incredibly captured to this ideology. It's very, very unusual to sort of see anything outside the mainstream narrative that's sort of trans rights and human rights, and that anyone who opposes that is somehow anti-transgender. Only with outlets like yours and maybe, a couple of other independents have I seen any kind of commentary outside the mainstream media narrative.
You've got to understand, you're talking to a misogynist Nazi. I've been banned.
Well, we're all misogynist Nazis now, aren't we?
And I've been banned from Twitter, so I'm like the devil incarnate. It's all. I'm sorry. You should be able to see the horns coming out my head. Hey, I want to talk about what's happening in Australia, too, Rachel. You had this parliamentarian in Victoria. I think she's been threatened for suspension just by speaking for or being supportive of Posey Parker. Right? Tell us about what's happening there.
Yeah. Look, she has been suspended. So Moira Deeming is a brilliant female Liberal politician who was elected to the Victorian Parliament towards the end of last year, which was, an incredible win for women's rights and children's rights in Victoria and in Australia. Myself and, all the other women's advocates who work on these issues were incredibly excited to see her being elected. It was, very well known what she stood for. She'd already been advocating on these issues for some time. And from the very beginning, the media and members of her own party, unfortunately, have had it out for her. She delivered her maiden speech at the beginning of the year, and the media responded with, far-right extremism and etc., because she was simply standing up for women's sex-based rights, standing up for the welfare of children against, harmful gender affirmation practices and so on. And so after the rally in Melbourne, which was gatecrashed by, by transgender activists, gatecrashed by, so-called neo-Nazis, the leader of the Victorian Liberal Party, John Pesutto, used that as an opportunity to basically say, oh, well, look, Moira must also, be a neo-Nazi or be somehow supportive of neo-Nazis.
This guilt by association thing, right?
Exactly. And, that's not standard. Any of us can sort of... if it's like if anyone is speaking anywhere, someone could turn up and it's like, oh, well, then clearly you're one of those people. It's like, no, that's not quite how it works. And so he moved a motion over the next day to expel her. No sort of, natural justice process
due process or anything
like that. No. And then they had the meeting on the Monday. He kind of went in all guns blazing, intending to expel her. And then that morning, before the meeting started, she actually had sent to all her Liberal Party colleagues with the help of a lawyer a document which basically categorically refuted the assertions that she was somehow tied into Nazis. And she also gave an incredibly powerful speech outlining, the reasons that why she actually advocates for women's sex-based rights, explaining that actually she was raised by a Jewish uncle who was a Holocaust survivor.
Oh, wow, and she played that card. Ooh, okay.
Such assertions were not only just completely inaccurate, but also incredibly offensive to her and her family. And she sort of outlined the fact that drawing these assertions and expelling her on this basis was going to have heinous consequences for her life, being associated, with this sort of vile ideology. And after the document that was sent to Liberal colleagues, after her incredibly powerful speech, it was incredibly clear to Pesutto that he was not going to have the support of the party. And so in order to save face, I believe, he opted to suspend her instead. But, the suspension doesn't have any...
Did the suspension require a vote or a meeting, or he could just do that?
So my understanding is that because of the way things panned out, I think he moved to suspend, and I don't think there had been any opposition. I think there were probably people from either side who weren't quite sure how the expel motion was going to fall, and so they sort of left it as it was. And the way he sort of pitched it to the media, and he's been doing the media rounds, is that he had the full support of the party to make that decision.
Geez, I'd very much like to, Rachel, if you can help us I'd love to interview her and talk to her. I want to ask you too, in Australia, and I'm not sure about this in New Zealand, it's unclear. Are these discussions on gender and the extremes of identity politics, are they falling into traditional left-right camps, if you like, the people involved in this? Or is this a mishmash of people from all over the political spectrum on both sides of this discussion?
It's very, very much the latter. So it's quite interesting, actually. Like my organisation would, be deemed of the more kind of, I guess, conservative ilk, but the majority of the women I'm actually working with are sort of left-wing radical feminists, and then you've got other conservatives as well, obviously. But it's a complete spectrum of people, women and men, obviously too. People who are just genuinely concerned about what gender ideology is doing to women's sex-based rights and protections and is doing to the welfare of children. So, when you're fighting an ideology that is incredibly nonsensical and dangerous, you're going to get people from all walks of life, because there are very good reasons from a variety of different angles for which to oppose it.
Do you think the state of this debate and discussion in New Zealand is worse than in Australia? That we've got
yes,
more
I
to
do. And again, and it goes back to that media issue because, unfortunately, these things just aren't being reported on. I mean, look, in Australia, our mainstream media is incredibly captured as well. So the government-funded ABC is terrible. SBS is not much better. But we do have outlets like, we've got Sky News, we've got The Australian, we've got some good sort of local papers like the Daily Telegraph. So there is a conversation that's able to be had that is not just one-sided. Whereas in New Zealand, again, some people don't even realise that the stuff's happening at all because they just don't hear about it.
No, or they are completely, to be honest, they're propagandised and misinformed. It's pretty Orwellian what has been going on here. I'm going to ask you, what do you think New Zealanders should do about that?
It's a really good question. Look, I think they need to, support outlets like yours. I think, journalists in general, politicians in general need to grow a backbone because I don't believe that every single politician and every single journalist or academic and so on is captured by this. And I think the ones that aren't need to actually, stand up and make their voices heard and their concerns heard because until we actually get people starting to speak out, in the media, in politics and in all walks of life, we're not going to make any changes on this. And, just for ordinary New Zealanders, you can have these conversations with your friends, with your family. And I think that's really important because these topics are so taboo and because they're considered so controversial, I think there are a lot of people who don't even realise that they're not alone, even though I would say the majority of New Zealanders would share the views that you and I are discussing right now.
Yeah, well, I can't speak for other New Zealanders. I'm just a journalist and I ask questions. And I have to say I sat in that press conference and I only asked that question because I had told my audience about this time on Monday, I'd said, look, I'm going down to the Prime Minister's media conference. What would you like me to ask them? And someone came on and they said, can you ask, or texted me and said, can you ask them if men can have penises? And I said, well, should I ask them that? And someone else rang and said, oh, that's a bit crass. Why don't you just ask them the question, what is a woman? And it wasn't part of a weaponisation or some conspiracy that Piers Morgan rang me or some Nazis rang me and told me to ask the question. It wasn't weaponised. It was literally crowdsourced. And when I asked that question, I have to tell you, the journalist I was talking about, gender lynch mob, actually muttered under her breath, it was called, oh, for sake. And the rest of the media groaned and then went very, very quiet as the Prime Minister showed his brilliant think on his feet style. And then, of course, in New Zealand media, nothing happened for 12 hours. Nothing. It wasn't mentioned until it became, I think, and I can't access Twitter anymore, I think it was a viral trend in the world, was it? Yeah.
It's had millions of views, yeah.
Yeah, so that's how it happened. I just want to tell you I'm not a Nazi, I'm not part of a conspiracy. It was just a question, which is what journalists kind of used to do. You just ask the question and you see what happens, don't you?
Oh, that's exactly right. And if more journalists were doing their job, then this whole thing would unravel a lot quicker. I mean, we saw the exact same thing happen with Nicola Sturgeon recently in Scotland, where she was questioned about, whether in every single situation a trans woman is a woman. And in this situation, we were talking about male rapists in women's prisons, and she was absolutely stumped. It was a very similar kind of, not quite sure type response. And the absurdity is just there, laid bare for all to see.
Keir Starmer did it too. He was the guy who came up with the percentage of women with penises. I'm still looking for that 0.1% there. Look, can I just say thank you very much for joining us today? And look, we have to kind of reality check in New Zealand now, and we have to reach out to the rest of the world, because otherwise we're stuck in our own weird echo chamber. And it's really good to get some overseas perspective on the stuff that is happening here, realising it is not just happening to this country, and that when I sit there going, what does the world come to, a whole lot of other people are doing the same thing. So thank you so much for your time. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you, Sean. It's been a pleasure.
All right. That is Rachael Wong. She's the CEO of Women's Forum Australia.